Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken, David Pruitt, and Russell Martin. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, David Pruitt.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, blog articles, and much more. Our goal is that you are inspired, encouraged, and that the things that you hear on this podcast would equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you are serving in. I should have taken a deeper breath.
That was a long intro. I am impressed.
Thanks, man. Let's get to it. So today, I have the honor of sitting down with my senior pastor, Ryan Ford, who is a senior pastor at Grace Fellowship here in Snyder, Texas. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, buddy.
Yeah. So like David said, I'm the senior pastor at Grace Fellowship. I've been here for 3 years. Before that, I was a senior pastor at a little church in Seymour, Texas, and I was there for 6 years. And before that, I'd gotten out of ministry and just did local stuff. I worked in the oil field. And then before that, I was a youth pastor. And so I've been in several different positions in ministry, but I'm loving where I'm at right now. I'm loving what God has called me to do. I've been married to my wife for 16 years. Her name's Amy. Shout out, Amy. I've got 4 kids. I've got a 15, 13-year-old, 8-year-old, and 5-year-old, and they keep us crazy busy along with everything at the church. But yeah, that's a little basis on who I am and a little bit about me.
Yeah. So today we are talking about the senior pastor youth pastor relationship. I think it's a topic that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think part of it is because so many youth pastors don't have a great relationship with the senior pastor, whether it's a disconnect or sometimes there's a big age difference.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a situation where senior pastor maybe was never a youth pastor, or maybe they went straight into being a senior pastor, so they weren't in, we'll call it a connectional ministry before that. And so we find a lot of student pastors and senior pastors just really struggling to have a good relationship. And so we thought it'd be fun today just to kind of talk about that, talk about what we've experienced in our years of ministry and kind of how things are working out for us now. Obviously, we hate each other. I mean, let's make that clear. He's the worst pastor ever. But, you deal with it. We all have our cross.
You make do.
You make do with what you got, right? I hope it's obvious that I'm kidding. We actually have a really good relationship, which has been a breath of fresh air. But we'll talk about that. First, before we really get too much into it, I want to talk about your experience as a youth pastor, because you've got some time as a youth pastor. So walk us through that.
So I probably had, if you were to put pastors into categories, I'd say I had probably 3 completely different representations of pastors while I was a youth pastor. Whenever I was an intern youth pastor and I was working with my very good friend, Gene Hudgens, love him to death. He was my original youth pastor whenever I was in youth ministry. And when I felt called into youth ministry, he was the first person that I called, and he gave me a chance and said, move up here. We'll help you find a job. We'll have you come and be we can't pay you, but we can make sure that we find you a job that'll let you be off on Sundays and Wednesdays. And you can work here. And that was in Dalhart, Texas. And the pastor that was there at the time, his name is Jerry Moore, and he would randomly come up and he would just sit in our office and just talk with us. And it wasn't just super formal. It was, how are y'all doing? How are you doing spiritually? How are you doing personally? How's ministry going? Is there anything that I can do to help? What do y'all have planned? Just wanting to know what we were doing and what we were involved in. And so I loved that about that church, and I loved working underneath him in that capacity. And then I moved from there. Jerry ended up getting reappointed that year, and Gene took a job somewhere else. He decided to take a job in another location. And so it kind of left me in limbo there. And so I made a choice to apply to different places. And I applied to here in Snyder and became the youth pastor here in Snyder. And when I moved here, I was very green. I had probably about 6 months experience as a youth pastor, dedicated youth pastor. Now I had experience with youth group, and, I had experience in being a student leader in those and all of those things, but very fresh, just started. And whenever I moved here, the pastor here was a fantastic pastor. And when I talk about all these pastors, I want everybody to understand that I don't have any animosity towards any of these pastors. They just led differently. And I think that that's the thing that everybody has to understand is not every pastor is going to lead the same way. And so when I got to Snyder, he was very much a hands-off pastor. He just left the youth ministry to me, and anything that we did, that was on me, and I was in charge of that. And if I needed him, I could go and ask him something. But for the most part, we didn't really have a relationship. We didn't have a connection. He was a great pastor. He did, really awesome things, but we didn't have any type of connection. And when things got hard and things got difficult, that lack of connection made it really hard to stay through those struggles. Yeah. And so we ended up finding out so we had just had our first child, and we found out that we were expecting our second child, and we couldn't make it off of the salary that we were making here, and we knew that we wanted to be closer to family, so we made a choice to move to another location, and I would be youth pastor in Andrews, and I became the youth pastor there. Loved the people there. The difficult thing in the youth pastor relationship there was that pastor was a very involved pastor in community events and in the Methodist organization. And he was a part of all kinds of different boards and things that. So this dude was moving all the time. I mean, he was never in the office, not because he was slacking or, anything like that, but he was just gone. He had meetings, he was out in the community, he did all of these things. And so the connection there was just non-existent. It was just that he wasn't there. And so that presented challenges in that, because again, you feel like you're on an island by yourself. And so I went from having a very connected pastor who was very much involved to having two pastors that weren't very involved. And so that was difficult for me, especially being fresh and being new, because I needed guidance. I needed, someone to be there and say, hey, you did this for this event, but you might look at in the future doing this. You might tweak this. You might look at this. You might have some benefits from that. And so I was in youth ministry for 5 years. If you count the internship, for about 6 years in that capacity. And then when I moved to Seymour and I was a senior pastor in Seymour, they didn't have a youth group. And so we started a youth group there in Seymour, and I was the youth pastor, music pastor for 6 years. And that's tiring. But so that's kind of my involvement in the youth and some of my experience in being a youth pastor.
Man, so you've seen quite a bit in a short time as youth pastor. Obviously there was some time away from ministry and different things like that as well, but for the most part, you you experienced a lot of different styles of leadership.
Right. Yeah.
I think is the nice way to put that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it can be challenging. Absolutely can be. Just a little bit of my experience. I'm going into my 20th year of ministry, 9th year here in September. And, I've experienced a lot, especially like I grew up in the Baptist world. And so I had the same senior pastor almost through my entire church experience when I was at South Georgia. And so hearing about senior pastors moving around a lot was just non-existent.
Right.
I mean, he had been the pastor for a long time. And I think when he left, he had been there 16 years or something and that's just what you're used to.
And the Methodist Church is very different in that.
Very different.
When you look between denominations of Baptist and Methodist and non-denominational and things of that nature, the average stay of the Methodist pastor is 3 to 5 years
at the most.
Yeah. And then there are times where even this church has gone through 1 to 2 years at a time and switched pastors. And so it's really hard in that sense as a youth pastor, when you have pastors just rotating in and out, that makes it even more.
It always felt like we were starting over.
Right.
You know, when I came here in 2014, by the time I had taken the job here, I had 3 senior pastors that year.
Yeah.
Now, granted, one was coming off of where I was in Canyon. And then I had a pastor in Roswell that didn't work out well. That's a whole story. And then coming here. So by the time I'd gotten here, Brian wasn't here long.
Yeah.
And so,
so you went from very stable to very unstable.
Oh yeah. I went from, I still highly regard Rick Inns as one of the greatest senior pastors I've ever worked with.
Shout out Rick.
Yeah. He did our wedding, just incredible human being, a huge mentor for me. And very much like Gene is for you. Rick was that for me, along with Tyler Looney, who was a guest of ours on the podcast as well.
Good guy. Mr. Looney.
Oh, I love that guy. God's doing some huge things in his life too. But going from there, from Canyon, where I was well supported and loved and had a mentor, and then to go from there to Roswell, where it was like, man, it was a rough situation. And then coming here and things,
and that one was almost combative, right?
It was
the one in
combative.
Roswell.
It was very combative.
It was almost like the youth against the church.
It was the youth against the church. It was music against music. It was traditional versus
worship
contemporary.
wars.
I mean, it was very much a worship war. It was a youth war. It was a children's war. Every ministry was at war with each other. And thankfully, it's not like that now. They've got a really good thing going for them now. I'm really, really grateful for that. There's some incredible human beings there. And so I love that for them. But coming here to Snyder, it was one of those situations where I just knew I wanted to serve and I wanted the opportunity, and it was really cool. But in that time, within about a year and a half or so, Brian left, and then we had Dave for 2 years. We had Kevin for 2 years, and Ryan's number 4, which at the time it seemed like a lot. But now that you've been here 3 years, 4 doesn't sound terrible in 9 years.
Right.
In the Baptist world, I guess it still does, but it doesn't sound as bad as it was, where it was like, oh man, I've served a lot of senior pastors. Right. So a lot of turnover, a lot of vision changes.
If we get to 4 and 12, we'll be average.
Yeah, exactly. So, we'll just stick around for a few years and make it work. I will say that said, this is the first experience I felt like I've had where I felt like him and I could do ministry together for 20 years and retire together and be perfectly fine, because we're the same age virtually. He's a little older, but
just an old man.
I never thought I would, outside of working with someone like Tyler. We always dreamed about him starting a church and calling me, and there's those people, those people that you gel really well with, and you're like, you ever started a church, I better be the first call that you make for your staff. But I never thought it would be an organic situation where God would send us a senior pastor and be like, man, this is someone I could serve for a really long time, and our families could grow up together, and all of that. So it's been a really restorative situation for me without going into too much detail. But I can tell you by the time he got here, I was actually interviewing at other churches. I had almost said yes. I got out of, it was crazy. Actually, I think I told you this. I had finished an interview, and maybe 20 minutes later, Ryan either sent me a long message or called me or something and said, "Hey, I know things have been rough, but I'm just going to ask a request, and you can say no, you can whatever, but give me a chance. Give me 1 year to prove that I can be not only what this church needs, but what you need." I had never had that in my life. I'd had some good senior pastors who cared, but I never had one that it was always, the typical church scenario where you as youth pastor have to prove yourself to the senior pastor. And it was the first time anyone had ever approached me and said, "Let me prove myself to you that I can be what you need." And it was like, okay, I didn't want to go. I really didn't. It was just, I felt like I couldn't stay in my lane, if that makes sense. It was like, you've got to be the youth guy, and you've got to be the worship guy, and you've got to be the design guy. And let's be honest, I was doing a lot of senior pastor role too. Some of the stuff that they were not willing to do for whatever reason. And I'm not trying to bash. It's just what it was.
Yeah.
And as Ryan was saying, coming from Seymour, he was senior pastor. That's what he got paid to do, but he was also youth pastor and music leader, and his wife was doing children's ministry, which they did together in a lot of ways. And so you were every role except for the secretary. Ultimately. And so one of the promises we made each other as he came in was, "I'll let you do your job if you'll let me do mine." And it's been that. It's been incredible. And I think for me, that has been so restorative because one thing I've done, and I'll make sure to put this resource in the show notes, but there's a book called The Disconnect that Doug Franklin wrote, and he's also been on the podcast. And it's one of my, I think we actually talked about it a little bit. It's one of my favorite books. I'm super dyslexic and ADHD, so reading books isn't really my thing. But I remember reading it and thinking, this is so incredible. It helped me understand the mind of a senior pastor, especially one who had been in ministry for a long time. But it also helps the senior pastor on the flip side understand the youth pastor motivation and mindset. And it's a really good way to bridge the gap. It's an incredible book. If you're in a situation or a season where you're struggling with your relationship with your senior pastor for whatever reason, I definitely recommend this book. And the funny thing is, I have handed that book to every senior pastor I have served, and not a single one of them have read it up until Ryan. And he was willing to. And that was another reason why I was like, okay, this guy is the real deal. And it helped that he is closer to my age, and we've experienced a lot of the same things. He was youth pastor here in this town for a while, so he understood the culture. And then on top of that, I have a 6-year-old. His son is almost 6.
Here in a couple of months.
And so they're like best friends. They love and hate each other at the same time, which is awesome. It's been really cool.
Almost brother-like.
Oh, very much so. And so it's been really cool to see that dynamic. And so it's very much a situation where our families can gel really well together. And like, as much as we can help each other, our wives can help each other. His wife has a lot of teaching experience. My wife is a teacher. I know my wife has cried to Amy several times over especially the first couple of years. And so it's been really cool for my family, not just our ministries and our church, but it's been really cool for my family too. So definitely a book I would recommend if you are struggling with that relationship, because sometimes it's not an intentional thing,
Very much so. I think that very few times it's intentional.
Right.
I don't think there are many pastors that go out of their way and they're like, I'm not making a connection with my youth pastor no matter what. Like, he's below me. How am I going to stoop to that level? Now, granted, there are some pastors out there that are absolute jerks, and they are full of themselves, and they are really hard to follow. So don't get me wrong, there are some of those out there, but I would say that they are far less the norm than what we might perceive. I think a lot of the disconnect is incidental. It's just because of the way things either have been or the way that they've just been. I think that there is room to change that.
So let's go into that. Let's talk about, like, what do you think are the key reasons why there is a disconnect? Whether that's your experience or just things that you've seen or speculation. We can get into that too.
Yeah, so I think that there are multiple reasons for disconnects. I think one is just busyness. I think that we can become so consumed and wrapped up in our own ministries and the things that we're doing and the things that we need to do, and they are good to follow through with and to be a part of. But I think we can become so wrapped up in what it is that we have to do that we forget, especially as pastors, that we're also called to pour into our staff. And I think it includes all staff: youth ministry, children's ministry, associate pastor, secretary, janitor, facility technician, whatever it is that you have at the church. We are called to mentor and to lead and to serve, because that's ultimately what we are called to do. We're called to be servant leaders. And sometimes we forget to serve the staff because we're so busy trying to serve the church. And so for me, I think it's just a busyness. And I think that it also, another reason is, I think pastors don't want to make others feel like they're trying to invade someone else's space. So I know that I've struggled with that concept moving here. And thankfully it hasn't held me back too much, because we do have such a good connection. But there are times where I think, well, David's got it. If I go and question or do anything, then it's going to look like I'm trying to invade or to take over or to, try and, I don't know, manipulate the situation or something of that nature. But, I think that it's that fear of, we don't want to overstep.
Right, there it is.
We don't want to overstep into somebody else's ministry. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's that, let's see, what is it called? That laissez-faire of just everybody do their own thing, very relaxed. I'm going to let you do you. I'm going to do me. And we're never going to cross paths. But the thing in ministry is it's all encompassing.
Right.
It should cross paths. Youth should cross paths with children's ministries. Children's ministry should cross paths with church ministry. Church ministry should cross paths with youth ministry and children's ministry, and youth should cross with church ministry. And so it should be an all-encompassing, it's almost one of those circle diagrams where all of them are connected to each other in some way, form, or fashion. And there are times where the youth do their own thing, and the children do their own thing, and the church does their own thing. However, if you're not coming together as an entire body, then you're not doing what we're meant to do in ministry.
Right.
And so I think that we need to get over that fear of overstepping.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing that I have really appreciated that I've never had is, because you're younger, because your girls are also in youth ministry with us and our leaders, which I think there's something really cool there too, is, you talk about the pastor kid dynamic. And one thing that I've always appreciated about you and Amy is that you don't force leadership out of them. It's like, just because you're here, just because you have to be here, doesn't mean you have to be a leader. You don't have to be involved any more than you want to be. And they don't set this crazy expectation. Now, granted, I saw leadership potential in them, and so I put them in leadership anyway. But it's been really cool to watch them do that and it be their own thing.
Right.
For both girls, I mean, they both have their own space. And Katie drums for us, and it's been really cool. But she works really hard, and nobody necessarily had to push her into that. It was, hey, if you want to try this thing, let's learn, let's grow, and let's do it together. And she's very much taken it on. It's been really cool to watch. But yeah, I mean, it's been a really cool dynamic there. But then the other side,
before we move on, hang on, I want to touch on something. It's a little off topic, but I think also, and I don't know if y'all have addressed it before in another podcast, but as pastors who have kids, you have that dynamic of pastors' kids that are just, they're, for lack of better words, they're stereotyped as pastors' kids. They're the worst.
Oh yeah.
Like they're jerks. They're, they
entitled.
Entitled. They are rebellious, all kinds of things. Right. And people look at that and it's kind of that stereotypical thing. And so one thing that Amy and I have tried to do also with our kids is not just not push them into leadership, but also not push unrealistic expectations onto them, in that they're not going to be perfect. They're teenagers. They're going to screw up. They're going to fail. They're going to do things that they shouldn't. And we were having a conversation one night with one of our kids, and the saying came up, what you do can affect my job as a pastor. And I stopped in that moment, and I remember vividly, I looked at my child and I said, I take that back. It doesn't matter what you do. If it affects my job, I will deal with it. That's not something you have to worry about. Don't feel like you can't screw up because it's going to affect something with me. Don't ever walk on eggshells in that capacity. If you screw up, I will handle it. If I lose my job, I lose my job. Then that's not the place I'm meant to be.
Yeah.
I will gladly sacrifice my job at the church so that you don't feel like you have to be perfect and walk on eggshells. And so I think that as pastors, we need to make sure that we don't force unrealistic expectations on our kids. They can't be perfect. They're not going to always do what they're supposed to. They're going to fail. They're going to sin. And they can even sin big. I mean, we're not talking like lies. We're not talking about stuff like that. I mean, don't sit there and hold them to some unrealistic expectation. Now, make sure that they know that their expectations, especially as followers, because my girls are Christians. They have decided to follow after Christ. And so we tell them there are expectations in that. And that's not meaning that you're going to be perfect, but just know that there are some expectations that God has of you. So just be aware of those things. And we remind them of that, but we cannot expect them to be perfect.
Right. And that's something that I've had conversations with your girls about is, when I hold you to a higher standard of leadership, it's not because you're a pastor's kid. That actually has zero to do with it. It's because when you step into a leadership role, there's already expectations on us as, men and women of God. But then on top of that, when you step into a place of leadership, there's a higher form of judging, so to speak.
A lot more judgment,
right,
for my kids than if just a random kid walked in off the street,
right?
Especially if the congregation knows that those kids are from like a rough home, where there's lots of issues and things of that nature. They will have an overwhelming amount of grace, but because they're a pastor's kid or even a church member's kid, I'll say even other leaders within the church. It doesn't even have to be a pastor, but because they're a leader, and whether you're Baptist, I know those are deacons, and you have elders, and we have leadership committees and stuff like that. But if you're a leader and your kids are disobedient and acting up, then you are automatically judged, and your kids are judged accordingly because, they have no excuse. They come from a decent home. Well, yeah, they might come from a decent home, but we're all still broken. We all still have our failures. And so, there's definitely a lot more judgment for those kids.
But I think it is important to sit down and have that conversation with your kid, especially, all of us that are listening are pastors in some right. Whether you're specifically youth ministry, or you're part-time or full-time, whatever your situation is, you're leading in a situation where if you have kids, there's an expectation just as much. And it is sad too, because sometimes that expectation can be so much higher. And that was something that my wife and I were talking about at lunch today, was maybe that's something that we need to address on the podcast, would be even the expectation of pastors' wives, and how
I agree
I
with
know
that.
a lot of wives that have walked away from faith because they were like, I didn't sign up to be perfect, and sometimes like, I know when we were in Roswell, there were many times where Kelsey would get asked to do something and they're like, we pay you. And I'm like, no, you don't, you pay me.
Yeah.
And so, but there were times where there was an expectation for her to be at certain things that had nothing to do with her calling or her passions or anything else like that. But because they pay me, then there's an expectation for her to also walk a certain line. And I think some of that is appropriate. Obviously,
well, I mean, you don't want her to go out and be, drinking it up
it's
on
like,
Friday night,
hopping bars and doing obviously there's
affairs or anything like that. I mean,
of course, but I mean, some things are a little bit unrealistic in the church for pastors' wives and for kids, and
she doesn't have a job role.
Right, exactly.
And you shouldn't expect her to have one.
Exactly. It's like, where do you want to serve? She happens to serve in our children's ministry. That's where she was needed most. And she loves it, and she's a first grade teacher, and it's been a good spot for her. But she's also helps out with worship and just really wherever she can help out. But I try to make sure she has that expectation of knowing, like,
and that's a blessing,
be gone,
not the expectation. And churches need to realize that. That is the blessing, to have a spouse of a ministry leader who is willing to help and to be a part of the church. It is not the expectation.
It's huge. So, if you're taking notes,
that's right. Write that down.
Write it down.
Pin it.
Highlight it. Circle it.
Pastor Ryan.
I think that's huge. And that's one thing that, in our current situation, ministry, his wife has taken on our children's ministry role. And that's really, really new. But it's been kind of interesting to have that dynamic with even her, and being able to have that conversation, as somebody who has kids in the youth ministry and has kids in children's ministry, and we both get to work in that dynamic. I think it's gonna be a fun thing moving forward. And I'm interested to see how that relationship opens up. So
very much.
So we've been talking about the reasons for disconnect. Do you see any other reasons why there might be any disconnect?
I think so. You brought up age, and I think age can play a role in that. There's a disconnect between interests, and there's a disconnect between, and I don't think this is just a youth pastor thing. I think that it's something that happens across all generations, and it's something that many struggle with. Like, it's hard to get our older generation congregant members to be a part of a youth ministry event. Definitely. Because they find it hard to connect. And so I think the age can play a role in it. I think that it's a terrible excuse, but I do think that it is an excuse that can be fleshed out and can be realized. And I think that that's an easy fix. Out of all of them, I think that that's probably the easiest thing.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's just understanding that it doesn't matter how old you are. We got to talking in CR Sunday. It was a really cool example that I didn't mean to go there, but Spirit kind of took over. We were leading worship, and I think it's really important to celebrate accomplishments that you see. And so we were doing worship, and the funny thing about it was, like, we had done worship out at the square, which is a couple of blocks away from our church. It's nothing terribly far, but when you tear down the sound equipment and everything, and then you move it somewhere else, and then you've got the challenges of trying to make everything work, which it went pretty smoothly, which was nice. But then so we tore everything down Sunday morning, set up at the square, tore everything down, and then set back up for Celebrate Recovery that night. And I remember joking, at the time, I don't think I was joking. I was totally serious, but I was like, I think we go acoustic tonight. Like, we're not even going to plug anything in. We're just going to lay everything on the stage. I'm going to come out into the crowd, and I'm just going to play my acoustic guitar, and we're just not going to do it. And like 20 minutes later, it was like, God hit me. Don't rob people just because you're tired. Like, would acoustic worship be great? Yeah. Would they have received it well? Of course they would. They're really sweet people. But at the same time, I just felt like I'd be robbing someone of a blessing. And I didn't understand why until we got into the worship service, and I was thinking, oh man, we're all exhausted. I am a redhead, so I was super sunburned. I mean,
part of that is your fault. You sat in the sun for like 40 minutes.
Well, to be fair, our sound guy was in the sun, and
he was
to have to sit by himself.
You definitely bore that burden with him.
I was not going to make him sit in the sun by himself while everybody else was in the shade. Not going to happen. So I
was sitting in the shade.
Yeah, you were. And it was like, everyone was like, hey, it was kind of cool. And Matt and I were like, no, it was not. To be fair, it started in the shade.
It did.
We set it up in the shade, and when the sun moved, it was like, oh, this is terrible.
That's right.
Like, we're like filling the sound system.
Next time we will know better.
Yeah, we're setting up a canopy for next month, which is a cool thing.
That would have been so much better.
Yeah, we didn't think about it until we were in the sun. Because last year we were in the shade.
Yeah, we could even set it low. Anyways, that's on a tangent. But
when you work together, you have to get those ideas out, especially when you're both ADHD and you're going to forget.
That's right.
So anyway, we got everything done, and we're in the worship service for Celebrate Recovery. And man, first song went really well, with the second song, I mean, whoa, it was not what I was expecting at all. Like, the worship went really well, and it was a smaller worship team. There was only like 4 of us. It was myself, your wife was singing, and then Katie was drumming, and
Briar was there.
Briar was playing piano. Yeah. That's what it was. I was like, was it all your family? That happens a lot, actually. He's got a big family.
And they all play something.
Everybody is on the worship team. Except for
our, but, and they'll get there eventually.
Oh yeah, 100%.
I'm not sure they'll get there before the 2 olders graduate, though. I mean, maybe Daisy.
I could see Daisy singing.
Yeah.
Anyway, another tangent. You're
right.
welcome. But
that's a freebie.
Where we got there was Katie had she's 13 years old. Keep that in mind. And she's drumming for, like, it's not just like youth worship team. She does youth worship team. She does Celebrate Recovery. She does our Sunday morning worship for contemporary. So she is like our drummer, period.
Yeah.
And then Ryan will fill in when she is just tired or sick or whatever. And then we've got another guy that we can pull from the Baptist church, because we actually get along really well with our neighbors, which is really cool. But yeah, for the most part, that's what we have. And she just killed it. It was like the perfect, absolutely killed it. And so I think sometimes it's really important to honor, especially publicly, when somebody does something. I think the church should be the forefront of celebrating. We talk about the world, and the world is so quick to, give themselves a pat on the back, but we don't do a great job as a church. We kind of we want everybody to fill a role. And when they do, we're kind of like, okay, you're doing it. And sometimes we'll do a volunteer appreciation once a year and give you a little piece of paper that'll get.
And again, that's the expectation, is that people will just sign up and they'll just serve.
Yeah. So I think it's important.
It's not the blessing, it's the expectation.
Exactly. And so we need to shift that culture. And so I wanted to celebrate what she was doing. And it was like the moment that I did, God just, vomited out of my mouth. It was like all this, and it was like, man, she's 13 years old and she's drumming. And what an incredible blessing to have someone who's that good at 13 years old. Like, I was drumming at 13 years old, but I wasn't as good as she is.
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't put as much time and effort into it as she does currently. And so I was like, and it just hit me. It doesn't matter if you're 3, 13, 33, 43, 53, 93. God can use you. God wants to use you. And we need to be talking about stuff like that. And so it ended up being this really cool moment. We ended up having an altar call that happened that was unexpected. And I look over and like almost everyone is hugging each other and crying. And it was this like crazy emotional moment. And it just started in noticing that someone did a good job.
Yeah.
And just celebrating that. And next thing we know, it became this very emotional moment. We went into, I think the song was I Speak Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. That was our last one. And his wife slays that song. And so it was really cool. This emotional, organic moment happened, and it wasn't forced. It wasn't manipulated. It wasn't anything other than just saying simply, use your gifts, use your passions, and celebrate it.
Yeah.
And all of it ended up going into that. And so I just think it's really incredible, the blessings and opportunities that you can have. And it doesn't matter how old you are or young you are, God can do something incredible in you. And, when I look at the scope of our ministry, we've had, our secretary is 63 years old, and she goes to camp with us. And she's involved heavily in our youth ministry.
She gives a sermon.
She gives sermons. I mean, it's just been a really
does a
cool
lot.
thing. So I think you're right. Just because there is an age gap, and sometimes, let's just be honest, we're not going to gel with everybody. We're just not, like when I look at our last 3 senior pastors we had here in Snyder, Kevin and I, our biggest connectional point was our love for sports. And so he's a big Cowboys fan. I'm a big Eagles fan. So we just tore each other up. It was great. Before that, Dave and I had a big appreciation for music and for literature. And so we would talk about all kinds of stuff. And Dave, not only did we share a name, but I kind of think that Dave is like looking in a mirror 30 years from now, 40 years from now, and seeing, oh man, like this is what I think I'm going to be when I'm an older person.
Yeah.
So he was kind of like a dad in that sense.
Yeah.
And then so with Ryan, it's been really cool because we're at the same age and we're into all the same things. And
so like, it's crazy
everything,
how much we actually connect over. I mean, between nerd type things like with Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers and nostalgic type things, video games.
Shout out to our other podcast.
That's right. All of those things. To sports. I mean, we both enjoy sports and things of that nature. Music. I love music, love playing. We both play. Again, books and pastors and sermons and
graphic design,
theology. Graphic design, everything. Theology. I mean, all kinds of things. We gel on all kinds of
He'll send me an article and I'm like, dude, that, like, he sent me one earlier and like we were in the middle of a meeting. I'm like reading it because, meetings. I'm like reading this article and I'm like, I kind of want to like throw a brick through a window. This is kind of taking me off. And I look at Ryan and I'm like, that sucked. He was like, right? So it was just, it's cool to have someone that you can not only gel with, but, we agree on 99. Okay, let's be honest. I haven't found anything that I disagree with you on yet. I'm sure
it'll get there.
Something.
It'll get there. It's only been 3 years.
Exactly.
We'll look at 10 and then we'll figure it out.
Still honeymoon, right?
That's right.
But it's been a breath of fresh air in that sense. You talked about not wanting to feel like you're encroaching in ministry, but what's been really cool is that he does go with us on trips, and we have been able to have that dynamic. And then there's been times where, when he felt like maybe it would be best for my girls if I can just take a step back and let them just kind of breathe a little bit. And there's always been that communication, which has been really cool. But I've never seen a senior pastor who shows up. I got really sick at the beginning of the year, and he stepped in and not only spoke, he led worship, he did all of it. And it was like, cause
it was like 2 or 3 weeks.
Cause I had no voice for 2 weeks.
I want to say it was 2 Wednesdays and 3 Sundays.
Something like that.
I think it was like that. Cause it was like a weird time that it happened. Like it happened on Saturday. So I picked up a Sunday and then Wednesday, Sunday, Wednesday.
Yeah. Cause I got COVID, was out for a week, came back and ended up getting strep and flu.
Yeah.
So it was just like,
it was crazy.
Let's just hit me with everything that I could get sick with. And I've had strep several times.
Calm down, Job.
I'm telling you, man. But I mean, it was really cool. Like I didn't have to worry about it. I just told him what we were talking about in a series. And if you want to continue the series, you can. If you want to do your own thing, I trust you, man. Totally. And the great thing is he has that relationship with our students too, that it wasn't a situation where he had to come in and like, okay, let me figure out how this dynamic is going to be. Exactly. Like he has a secret handshake with just about every student. Let me tell you why that matters. Like if you're a youth pastor, you know this. How many senior pastors have that kind of relationship with the students? You know, to be able to do that, and not just because it's like it's and like you said, it's not a micromanaging thing. It's because he genuinely cares about these students and wants to connect.
Very organic thing.
Yeah, and he's got something different with pretty much everybody, which has been really cool. He could be sporty. Our athletes love him because they can't beat this guy. He's good at everything. If you don't believe me, Brent also has a good relationship with Ryan.
Ask Brent.
You were his wife's youth pastor, right?
I was. Yeah. I was for, I want to say 1 year. I want to say it was for her senior year. I think she was a senior that year.
Yeah.
She might have been a junior. I might have had her for 2 years. But yeah, I moved in and she was a upperclassman. But yeah, I did have his wife.
So yeah, there's
and I knew him. I mean, because they were dating at that time.
Yeah.
And so he came around quite often.
Mm-hmm. And now we all direct a camp together.
That's right.
See, it's beautiful. Beautiful way that God connects us in a lot of ways. Actually, that's how I ended up on this podcast in a lot of ways is I already had the youth pastor group with Brent and Russell. But then also being able to do camps together and different things like that has been really cool. And so it's incredible the way that God has just worked in our little community because Abilene's only an hour and a half away from us. And so, which if you don't know, that's where Brent's at. So shout out Brent. We haven't shouted him out yet.
That's right. Shout out
We've
Brent.
talked about him, but we haven't shouted him out. So if there's your official.
That's right. That is a common thing on our other podcasts.
Yes, we shout out a lot.
We'll sure say shout out. But you did touch on one thing that I want to make sure that. So we were talking about reasons for disconnect. I think that the one thing that we don't talk about is senior pastors, for the most part, very few of them are really young. I mean, the age demographic of pastors is fairly older, but that means they've also been in ministry longer. And so they are spiritually, mentally, and physically tired.
Right.
They are burned out. They've been doing ministry for so long and they've seen, let's be real, they've seen so many things that I'm sure that they're also a little jaded in things or frustrated maybe. And so that makes it difficult that when you're struggling with that much burnout and being that tired, you can't think about fitting anything else on your plate. And that's your local ministries included. You cannot think about adding youth ministry onto your plate. You can't think about adding that relationship to your plate because you don't have anything left to pour out. And so I think it's important for pastors and youth pastors to make sure that you are refilling your cup, because there are so many pastors out there that are burned out and they are just exhausted. And so they don't have energy left to make those connections and to really take the time to pour into those ministries, because let's be real, pouring into youth ministry is a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the kids that come can be a lot.
Yeah.
And as a pastor, when you're trying to pour into multiple different ministries, it's really easy to run out and to not refill. And so I think that that's another reason for
a good example of that. As we did our fish fry a couple of weeks ago, and as a senior pastor, there's an expectation where you have to, we joked and said, got to make my rounds, but it was true.
Right. Yeah.
It was very true. Like we were all hanging out playing a game together, and and of course our running joke is that Ryan is just good at everything.
That's right.
And will win everything,
That's right.
Whether there's a competition or not.
However, Joy was beating me that day.
Was she actually beating you?
Oh yeah.
I thought you were winning.
Her and I were going back and forth a lot, but I do think she was winning.
But he was playing, and then he was like, all right, guys, got to go make my rounds or whatever. But we love playing, stupid games that we probably shouldn't be playing. But yeah, I mean, that's the truth. And so,
Tapple, youth pastors, if you have not looked up this game, you need to go get Tapple.
It's a fantastic game.
It is so much fun.
Oh man, we
have a lot of fun.
Super easy,
not difficult at all.
We started that as a staff, right?
Yes.
It was staff, and then it
Because
got into
Leslie
our
brought
youth
it up.
ministry. That's right. Yeah.
They did it at a family vacation. They went to Ruidoso,
Yeah.
and they played that game, and she loved it so much that she told us we should play it as a staff. And so we did.
Yeah. We tried to once every couple months or so play a game together at one of our staff meetings. Here lately, we haven't had time. You know, you get into the craziness of summer and busyness.
Things have been nuts.
A little bit of staff shifts and stuff like that has been a little bit interesting, but yeah, it's really important to be able to do that. And so we had so much fun that we decided to introduce it to a couple of our students at CR
and
Briar, of course. And just had a blast. And so now it's like almost every Sunday night, it's like, what game are we going to play?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, with the fish fry, we were playing this game, and then Ryan's like, okay, I got to get around and, you know, go mingle with other people, but kept sneaking back over to the youth.
I'd pick back up the game, and I'd win a couple of hands, and then I'd go away.
He'd sit down, he'd pick up his hand that he had dropped down, he'd play a card, walk off, and win. We were like, we can't even stand you right now.
That's right.
Like he literally did. He just played a card, walks off, and we realized he won. So of course I
was wondering if I won that hand.
Oh, you totally won, but because you weren't there, we decided that you defaulted or you were disqualified from that round. So we went with a different card.
That sounds about
just to
right.
make sure you don't win.
That sounds about right.
You weren't,
because I played a good card. I was like, "Ooh, this is a good one," and I slid it in, and I got called to go and do something, and so I walked off, and it was like 15 minutes later I came back, and they had told me that somebody else won it. So this is the first time that I'm hearing that I actually won that.
Oh, he totally won it, but we weren't going to give him the satisfaction.
That's right.
So, but yeah, man, I think you make a really good point there, is that age and stage matters, you know, and obviously we are really fortunate to be in and blessed to be in a situation where we do gel really well. But I do know people who have a much larger age gap, but they still can gel well. And I think what it comes down to is intention.
100%.
Ultimately, that's what it comes down to is obviously, like Ryan said, like you have to pour back into yourself, especially if you're tired and burnt out, and you need to be honest about that. But I think
take time. I don't think pastors take enough time, because ministry can be all consuming. It's not just office stuff. When you step out and you're in the community and you're doing all of those things, again, that's still pouring out. That's still doing those things. And so, you know, you and I have had lots of conversations, because David's at the office 24/7. Now, to his defense, his wife works here during the school year. So normally and his son goes to school here. And so if nobody's at home, he's just at work. And that's not to say that he's only working on work stuff. He could be doing graphic design or anything like that he wants to do or personally enjoys doing. But he doesn't take a whole lot of rest.
Yeah, I'm bad at that.
And I think a lot of pastors are. I think a lot of pastors are terrible at taking time off and rest away from things. And I think part of it is a control issue, especially for senior pastors.
Oh, definitely.
It's that if I take a step away, then things are going to start to fall apart, or things aren't going to get done the way they should be done.
Some of that's probably insecurity too.
Oh yeah, 100%. And so I think that is youth pastors and pastors and people in ministry, you need to take your time off seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, it's meant to be a Sabbath for a reason. And so take it seriously. God told you for a reason to take time off. So it needs to be treated that way.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and I think when you're intentional with taking time off, but also intentional in having those relationships, you'll see a dynamic shift change. Because if you're in that position where for whatever reason you don't feel like you connect well with your senior pastor or with other, sometimes it's not even just the senior pastor, sometimes it's other ministers inside your church. And sometimes it's not even anything that you're doing wrong. Sometimes it's just that I know I've been in situations where ministries get pit against each other.
Yeah.
When I first came here, that was the issue. I was pit against our worship leader before I ended up she left and I ended up taking the position, my first week was like, hey, you're going to take her job. I'm like, whoa, what? Like,
Yeah.
I signed on for one job.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that dynamic was really, really difficult. And the senior pastor was one who really stirred that up, and made it very difficult for us. And then, you know, that trickled down into the members and leadership, and we were constantly pit against each other. And it wasn't until the week she left that we sat down and just hashed it all out and had a conversation and realized we had each other's backs more than we realized, in a lot of things, but sometimes that can be a difficult thing. And so I think it's important to be open and honest and vulnerable.
There you go. That's the word I was about to say. It's not just about intentionality, it's about vulnerability also. If you're not connecting with someone, have that conversation with that person. Don't they can't read your minds.
Right.
I mean, let's be real. We have so much going on is ministers, youth ministry, pastoral ministry, children's ministry. Sometimes it's really hard to read other people, and it's hard to see that they're struggling, and because you're dealing with your own struggles. And so when you're not connecting and you're not vibing or gelling, or you feel like there is some type of gap or void in that relationship and in that connection, have that conversation. You know, what's the worst that's going to happen? You know, if you have that conversation with the because we're talking about youth pastor relationship. So if you have that conversation with your pastor, and you know, I guess the worst thing he can say is, yeah, it's because I don't like you. I mean, you know, I guess that could be the worst scenario, but at least at that point, right. But at least at that point, at least, you know, like, oh, okay.
Oh,
so this is not going to work out. This is something I need to look at fixing externally rather than internally inside of the ministry.
Yeah. Cause that's super tough. My goodness. Like, you know, if it was a situation where I was like, man, I feel like we're not gelling well, and you were like, well, yeah, because I hate you.
Right.
Well, crap. Obviously either I can work and ask the hard questions like, well, what is it going to take to change that? Or maybe I need to go, you know, and sometimes that's true. I think there are certainly situations like that. And people I've talked to, especially other youth pastors who are in a similar situation like that. Sometimes the only thing you can do is just.
But I think we oftentimes bounce too soon or leave too soon.
Oh, so true.
Because we're afraid to have that confrontation. We're afraid to have that discussion. And so I think that if we are willing to be intentional and vulnerable, then you can solve a lot more problems than if you just ignore it and just hope that something changes. Because unless it's addressed, it's probably not going to change. Because in my mind, if nobody comes to me and tells me anything differently, I think things are great. Like, if somebody has a problem with me and they don't come and tell me, and somebody comes and asks me about it, I'm like, man, so-and-so and I have the best relationship. Like, everything's great. And then come to find out that person is ticked off at me and they hate my guts. I'm like, oh, oops, my bad. Like, I didn't know this. So I think that being intentional and vulnerable is a big part. You have to have open communication. You have to. And that's where it starts. It has to start with communication. And so if you're struggling with your connection with your pastor, that's the first place to start, is open up the lines of communication. Tell your pastor, and it can be formal, it can be informal. Go to lunch. If your pastor enjoys golfing, go golfing. It doesn't matter if you suck at golfing. Like, if that's their gig, I mean, then go do it. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? He laughs at you, and then y'all joke about it,
and then you have a better relationship.
That's right. So, I mean, whatever it is, it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be in the office, it can be out of the office. It doesn't matter. Just set something with the pastor. Say, hey, I am really struggling right now, and I really need to have a conversation with you. If you could make some time where we could have a conversation, that would be great.
And I want to make one thing clear in that, because we have done that. Like, for me personally, I've been struggling with my own personal insecurities and different things like that. And I just finally hit a point where, like, I couldn't hold it all in anymore. And somewhere along the line, I didn't realize it until it just all, sometimes we ignore a problem for too long and it all bubbles up into a point where all of a sudden you wake up and you realize things are not okay. I got to that point this year, and I remember sitting down I say sitting down, I didn't sit down. I paced around his door.
Yeah.
And said, if it's okay, can we talk? And he was like, yeah, what do you need to talk about? And I'm like, a lot of things. Like, I realized, you said earlier that ministry is very much like being on an island by yourself. And I began to realize I've got a lot of friends, but I don't have a lot of people I can talk about, talk openly about my struggles, because the hard part about being a pastor, and you guys all know this, is you can't just talk about anything to just anyone.
Yeah.
There are certain things that if you say, well, I'm really, really frustrated at this leader. Well, oh crap, I'm a fixer, so I'm going to go talk to that person for you. And next thing you know, it becomes a huge problem,
And sometimes the pastor can be that way. So be cautious. I mean, don't just go and throw all caution to the wind. Make sure that your pastor doesn't have a history of doing those types of things.
Yeah.
And I mean, then go from there.
Yeah, for sure. And I knew that Ryan had been in a lot of the places that I was struggling with. And I knew that he had struggled with those things too. Heck, he left ministry for a while. And so I knew he understood the frustrations I had. And they weren't at all directed towards him either. So that helped. Actually, not even a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, but here's one thing I want to caution. When I asked, it was like, sure, yeah, let's go. And then some crazy situations popped up for him. And it was something that he went from, sure, I've got the time, to I'll have time in a couple of weeks. And maybe that's like 3 or 4 weeks, but be patient and be willing to keep asking, because sometimes we do get into those seasons where it's like, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable and I'm going to ask my senior pastor for help.
Yeah.
You have to know that maybe when you do, your senior pastor may be swamped, your senior pastor may be burnt out, your senior pastor might be any of these reasons that we've talked about, and a plethora of others for disconnect. And you may have to be patient and stay on them a little bit. You may have to say, hey, this is something I really need. And I need you to understand this is really important to me. So let's set a date. Yeah. And I expect you to do your best, but also have grace, have grace and say, hey,
because we set up a lunch.
Yeah, we did.
And then I completely missed the lunch and we didn't talk about it. No, what it was, we were waiting on each other. It was kind of a miscommunication.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a weird, like I was waiting on David to let me know if we were still going to lunch and what we were doing.
And I realized he was still dealing with this dynamic. And
and so it was kind of a weird deal.
I didn't want to push another thing onto his plate.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was so funny. We were just waiting on each other. So it was like, okay, well, if we're both good, then let's set a date. And then, again, life happens. And it was one of those things, you just have to have grace, but you have to be intentional, and that was the biggest thing for us is, had we communicated a couple of weeks before that, we would have probably already met 2 or 3 times, and so,
And reminding is, I think that people are so afraid to, bring things back up because they're afraid that they are nagging, or that they are being a pain, or they're being insensitive or things of that nature. However, knowing your pastor's characteristics also helps, in that I am very ADD, in that I am very forgetful.
Same.
I just am, and I don't mean to be, and I try to do my best. I set reminders, I set calendar events and all of these things, and I try to do my very best in doing that, but it doesn't always happen.
Sure.
And so when I forget about something, it's not because I don't view that thing as being important,
right?
Like with the lunch, it's not that I didn't view that as being important. It's that life happened.
100%.
Things were we were in a time of struggle, and eventually we did we did meet, and we did
Yeah.
have our conversation. But don't be afraid to remind.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to have that conversation again of, hey, I came to you last week and I asked if there was time that we could meet, and I haven't heard back from you. I'm just trying to check with your schedule, and I want to be intentional about this, and it's something that I'm really struggling with. I think that it goes with how you go about addressing it.
Yeah.
You can have an angry tone, and you can be frustrating, say, look, I told you I needed to talk to you, and you have not darkened my doorstep, and I need you to come and talk to me. So set some time. Whereas if you just change a few of those words and change your tone, it will go a long ways.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Again, it goes down to having some grace.
Yeah, and then also remember, and I want to be careful about saying this, but know your place. As a youth pastor, like, we're really good friends. We like hanging out. We like doing things, but at the same time, he is still my boss, and there has to be a level of respect. And if I go to him and say, look, dude, we made plans and you forgot, so now I'm going to berate you for the next 20 minutes. That's not graceful. It's not the loving Jesus way. And it's certainly not helpful,
Right.
And so when we did talk about it, it was on both ends, it was very much a graceful thing. And it was just like, okay, hey, whenever we have some time, let's talk. And I was at a place where I was probably critical. But I wasn't in a situation where it was like, I'm just going to quit everything.
Yeah.
If I had been, I would have been a little bit more like, hey, we really have to talk right now. If you've got some time today, like, it's got to happen today.
Yeah.
Like, I think sometimes you have to do that, but do it in a way that just says, hey, I'm really, really sorry. I respect your time. But I have to talk. And I think all of us as pastors understand that, because we have people who come into our offices all the time.
If it's urgent, make sure that your pastor knows it's urgent.
Yeah, of course.
Don't be flippant about it. Don't be
passive.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's really, really important for us. I was probably a little bit more passive about it, because I didn't want it to seem like I definitely wasn't in a situation where it was like, drop everything, but I do need to talk within the next few weeks, because I'm struggling personally, and I want to be in a place where I'm healthy, because I'm not going to be able to lead well or do my job well if I don't address myself personally. That's that filling yourself up. That was my problem. Was ultimately what it came down to was I was doing more than I had the ability to do in some ways. And I wasn't taking time for myself. And I needed to hear him say that it was okay to say no.
Yeah.
That's what I needed, and maybe you're in that same situation where you feel like the weight of the world on your shoulders, and you feel like you have to say yes to everything. And maybe you need to just have a conversation, say, is it okay to say no to this one thing? And your pastor may say, yeah, that's totally okay. Or let's get a team together and let's help you out with that. Or, or it may be a ministry where you also have to understand that maybe your pastor needs you to suck it up for a season, and may say, no, you can't say no to that one, but let's look at an area where maybe you can gain a little bit more time. You can't give this up. It may be like,
you can't give Wednesday nights up.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You can't give up Wednesday nights, but you don't have to come in on Friday. You really go take a rest day, go do something fun for you. Have that compromise, have that conversation.
And that's the thing. So in knowing ministry and being youth pastor, I think that's probably what I'm most relaxed on is hours, at the office, because for me, I know that you're going to be here from 8 a.m. on Wednesday to 8 or 9 p.m. that night. And so that's a 12-hour day. That's a long day. And so when I look throughout the week, I'm like, okay, and we take office days are on Friday. So we close office on Fridays. But even outside of that, I tell the staff all the time, take the time you need. Whatever that, if it's a half a day here, if it's a full day here, if it's whatever it is, make sure to take that time.
For sure. And he's been really good about that. He's Even to a point of I would jokingly and lovingly say he nags me about taking vacation
all the time.
I'm the worst.
He still hasn't scheduled his time for this summer.
Well, no, not the summer, but in September.
Oh yeah, you do have something in September.
See, I'm doing better.
But it's only a week, right?
Well, it's like 3 days, but it's progress.
He gets 3 weeks of vacation.
Progress, y'all.
3 weeks of vacation is what he gets.
I have the most vacation of anybody in our staff.
No.
And I would take the least amount.
I get 4.
You get 4?
Mm-hmm.
What? When did that change?
Well, it's because it'll change this year. So I get 3 right now.
Oh, really?
And I'll get 4 because I'll be 10 years in ministry.
Oh,
yeah. So it goes back to the old book of discipline that it steps up in that.
I didn't realize that. I thought it just went off of like experience at this church.
No.
That's cool. That's really cool that you have.
Yeah. So I got 4 weeks.
I always jokingly tell people they can have my vacation. I won't use it. But then he gets mad.
Then he's going to get karate chopped in the school.
But that said, don't make my mistakes. Like find ways to get good outlets. And I'm learning and I'm growing and getting a little bit better in that dynamic. And so trying to, like this summer, one thing that I've been doing is instead of showing up at 7 a.m, like I always do, it's okay to show up at 9, especially like on a week like this week when we don't have anything.
Yeah.
Like, show up at 9 and actually rest. And instead I spent the whole morning wrestling with my son and we had a blast and it was great. Yeah. And so I didn't rush to get into the office today, which was awesome. I'd never done that before. So I'm learning, I'm growing, and I hope you guys are too. So last question, we've kind of touched on it, but I wanted to ask it anyway. What is some advice that you would give someone who is struggling with their relationship with their senior pastor?
Don't give up too quickly. Don't give up on your relationship too quickly. I think that too many people are just willing to shake the dust off their sandals and move on.
Nice.
I know. I try.
That's sort of like biblical.
That's right. That's right. But I think that too many people move on too quickly before they have the tough conversation. So again, don't be too quick to move on, and be brave enough to have the difficult conversations. They're difficult for a reason.
Yeah.
However, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. And so if you can have a tough conversation with your pastor and come out the other side with a better relationship, then it's so much better than moving to a different church and trying to build a relationship that may or may not be there. So you're rolling the dice, you're gambling on what the next church might be like. And every church is going to have its struggles.
Oh, yeah.
You're never going to find the perfect church. You're never going to find the perfect ministry. You're never going to find the perfect pastor. You're never going to find everything that aligns. There's going to be something. Mm-hmm. So take what you can, change what you can change, and understand what you can't. And there might be a season where you're not going to have the greatest connection with your pastor. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a connection.
Yeah, for sure.
But if you are in a season where you don't have a great connection with your pastor, your senior pastor is not the only pastor in town or in your influence group. Mm-hmm. There are other people that you can reach out to and that can help pour into you and can help guide you and can help lead you in a way that you need to go. And so lean on those people. Lean on those people, knowing that you're just in a season at that point.
Yeah.
But again, if you are struggling, have those tough conversations. Because what do you have to lose? Even if you're at the verge of quitting and leaving, okay, if you have the conversation and things don't go well, then okay, it's just more fuel to the fire of, or more evidence that you need to move on.
Yeah.
Okay. So then move on. don't move on before you have that conversation.
Yeah, because you're going to take that baggage with you.
Yeah.
And so many of us think, oh, it's okay, I'll just go work at another place where they'll appreciate me.
Mm-hmm.
But if you leave your church with this mentality that the grass is greener on the other side,
Mm-hmm.
guess what? It's not.
Yeah.
And there are things that maybe drive you nuts about your current situation that are better in another environment. But then you're going to create a new set of problems. And so if you just take that from job to job to job, it layers and it stacks, and you find yourself getting frustrated way faster, burning out way faster than you've ever. And what happens is, and we've all felt this cultural shift where we are seeing really, really incredible pastors leaving ministry and ultimately leaving Christianity altogether. And I think part of that is because they're taking baggage from place to place, expecting to fill these holes in their lives. And ultimately, that biggest hole is Jesus. And he preached about this a couple of weeks ago, and it was really incredible. It was this idea that we fill, we ask Jesus into we ask Jesus into our heart, and then there's this like we start to like take Jesus out, and we take little sections, and it's not like I believe that's what you said. It's not like you
little
just
pieces.
take Jesus out. It's just like little pieces of Jesus,
and we try to other things.
We put other things inside it, and ultimately what it comes down to is we try to fill. I loved your puzzle metaphor. It's almost like if you have this whole puzzle, but you're missing this one piece, and it's like, okay, so I've got this one little piece here that's missing in my heart. And so then we try to fill it with other things like, a lot of times, unfortunately, it becomes sin. A lot of times it's like lust or envy, or maybe it's even looking at the church next door and saying, man, they have it so much better than I do. And I wish I could work with them. And, we start to basically covet in our own minds. And, so we start to fill all these different things, but it's not the actual puzzle piece that we need. It's Jesus is ultimately what we need. And so if we number one, remember that it's Jesus that's going to fill those holes and those voids that we need. And then number two, exactly what you said, like taking the time to have that hard conversation, because again, what do you have to lose? If you're in a situation where you're close to quitting, okay, that's fine. Have that hard conversation, be vulnerable, and try. And if it doesn't work out, you can say, hey, I tried. Now it's time to move on. And hopefully you can find a better situation for you, for the church that you're in, and the church that you're going to. And so having that tough conversation is very, very important.
Yeah. And if you carry your baggage around with you, there's going to be transference in that 100%. You're going to transfer something that was from your old pastor to your new pastor. And that's not even going to be a characteristic of your new pastor, but because you carried it around with you, you're just going to automatically assign it to that pastor.
Completely unfair to that person. And it's completely unfair to you.
Yeah.
So, and I'll be honest, there was a part of me that did that. I had so many different pastors, and it was a struggle. And I kept thinking, like, I had this conversation with my wife, and everything that you were saying, and my wife was, she's my best friend, and she has seen the hurt that I've gone through, and she's experienced that with me. And she was like, there's no way. Like, she read the message and she was like, there's no way that sounds too good to be true. And everything that everyone was telling me about your character, and I had seen you at camps and stuff, but like everything that I remember having a conversation with Brent, and Brent was like, dude, you have no idea how lucky you're about to be. And I'm like, what? Like, it can't be this good.
Yeah.
But it was. And then it kept being that way. And I kept telling him, I was like, the first few months, I probably annoyed him with how many times I was like, dude, let me just tell you, thank you for being you. And here's why. And I just kept saying it over and over and over, because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm living the dream now. And I can't let him leave. So it was like every time there was like an issue at the church, I was like, oh, let me tell him why I love him. So he doesn't leave, And so it was almost like a little kid who was like, oh man, like, Daddy, please don't leave us.
We don't need milk. We don't need milk.
We're good.
I'll go get the milk, Dad.
Don't walk away.
Right.
Especially with the division, like the denominational split.
Yeah.
There were times where I was like, oh my gosh, if this doesn't go a certain way and we lose him, I'm done. Like, I remember thinking, I'm going back to the Baptist church. But no, it's been good. But have those hard conversations, because it's totally worth it.
For sure.
Man, what a great podcast. What a great conversation.
There's a lot of good information.
Yeah, for sure. Have these conversations. And I want to throw this out before I do our outro. If you are struggling with that and you need advice, please talk to us. Email us at the podcast or on Facebook or any one of us. I would love to talk to you. Ryan would love to talk to you.
They can put my information in, whatever.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure that his information is in the show notes. Same with Brent and Russell. All four of us have a huge heart for you guys. We love you guys and would love to have that conversation. If you're struggling, no, you don't have to go through that alone.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've served some rough senior pastors, and I know what that's like, and would love to sit down and have that conversation with you, because I know what that's like, and I want to help you, and I want you to know that you're not alone, and all four of us are that way. And I could definitely speak for Brent and Russell. That's what we're here for. They started this podcast with the idea of having, sitting down and having an open conversation, but also to sit down with other youth pastors and have conversations with you guys.
Yeah.
So thank you guys so much for listening. We would be honored if you would share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that really stood out to you on your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. Finally, if you would like to be on the show in the future, we'd love to have you. Please reach out to us on social media or send us an email at podcast@studentministryconversations.org. And we would love to set up a time for you to join us. Have a great week, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Peace out.